On the morning of May 1st, 1925, the air inside the mahogany-paneled suites of the Central Union Trust Company in New York was thick with the scent of expensive Turkish tobacco and the ozone of the city's early electrical grid. This was not merely a meeting, it was a financial execution. Anna Thompson Dodge and Matilda Dodge Wilson, the widows of the two most formidable brothers in automotive history, sat before a mountain of legal bond paper. At precisely 10:15 a.m., they finalized the sale of the Dodge Brothers Motor Company to the investment firm Dillon, Reed & Co. The price was $146 million in cold, liquid cash. In the economic reality of 2026, this single transaction represents a staggering $2.64 billion. It remains to this day one of the largest cash transfers in the history of global capitalism. The technical mechanism of this sale was a precursor to the modern leveraged buyout. Clarence Dillon, the shark-eyed financier leading the purchase, had orchestrated a complex web of gold-backed notes and preferred stock to consolidate the capital. While the widows signed their names with gold-nibbed Waterman pens, the ink, a specialized iron gall mixture designed for permanence, served as the final seal on an era of family-owned industrial titans. The transaction included the massive Hamtramck plant, a 120-acre fortress of American productivity, and a network of 4,000 loyal dealers. The widows were not selling a company. They were offloading a burden of steel and grease that had claimed their husbands' lives. For them, the $146 million was a liberation from the soot of Detroit. Macroeconomically, 1925 was the fever dream of the Roaring Twenties. The Coolidge administration had slashed the top marginal tax rate from 73% to 25%, creating a vacuum of capital that sought massive industrial acquisitions. The stock market was no longer a tool for growth. It had become a casino for the elite. As the widows exited the bank, the sheer weight of their new liquidity altered the financial landscape of the United States. They were now the wealthiest women in the world, yet they were fundamentally disconnected from the source of that wealth. The heirs, specifically Horace Jr. and Delphine, were notably absent from the signing. They were already entrenched in the luxury corridors of the French Riviera and the Gold Coast of Florida, spending dividends that had not yet cleared the clearinghouse. The archival details of that morning reveal the extreme contrast of the era's social strata. While a Dodge factory worker earned roughly $6 a day, about $108 in 2026 value, the legal fees for this single morning's work exceeded the lifetime earnings of 1,000 such men. The widows wore custom mourning couture from Parisian houses, likely Jean Patou, whose scents, specifically Amour Amour, were just beginning to dominate the high society olfactory landscape. Outside the bank, the streets were clogged with the very machines that had built this fortune. Model 30 Dodges, known for their all-steel bodies in an age where competitors still used wood framing. The sound of the city was a rhythmic clatter of Underwood typewriters and the distant backfire of internal combustion. A mechanical symphony for a world that was rapidly losing its soul to the ledger. The irony of the $146 million signature was that it stripped the Dodge name of its protectors. Clarence Dillon was a mathematician of profit, not a builder of engines. He immediately restructured the company to satisfy shareholders, diluting the rigorous engineering standards that John and Horace had established. The brothers had built a reputation on dependability, a word they practically invented for the automotive lexicon. Without them, the word became a marketing slogan rather than a manufacturing mandate. As the widows' limousines pulled away from Wall Street, they left behind the only thing that kept their children grounded: the necessity of work. They had traded the grit of the foundry for the sterile safety of a trust fund, unaware that they had just funded the destruction of their own bloodline. But what nobody in the humid New York room realized was that by selling the company, they hadn't just sold factories and patents. They had sold the only purpose that maintained the Dodge family's sanity. The Dodge dynasty did not begin in a boardroom, but in the red clay dust of Niles, Michigan, and the soot-stained workshops of late 19th century Detroit. John Francis Dodge and Horace Elgin Dodge were more than brothers. They were a singular biological unit of industrial intent. Born in 1864 and 1868 respectively, they were the sons of a machinist who taught them that the only truth in the world was found in the tolerances of a lathe. By the time they reached Detroit in 1886, they were the Brawling Brothers, red-haired, short-tempered, and possessed of a mechanical genius that bordered on the supernatural. They worked for the Murphy Engine Company for pennies, perfecting the art of the internal combustion engine when most of the world was still hitching horses to wagons. Technically, their first major breakthrough wasn't a car, but a bicycle. In 1896, Horace patented a dirt-proof ball bearing that revolutionized the cycling industry. They formed the Evans and Dodge Bicycle Company, utilizing high-carbon steel and precision machining that made their bikes the most durable in the world. This venture provided their first real capital, roughly $5,000 in 1910, which scales to approximately $162,000 today. But more importantly, it established their manufacturing philosophy. Over-engineer everything. When they eventually transitioned to automotive parts, they brought this obsession with them. They became the primary suppliers for Oldsmobile and eventually the secret weapon of a struggling visionary named Henry Ford. In 1903, the Dodge brothers made the most consequential gamble in industrial history. They agreed to manufacture 650 chassis, engines, transmissions, and axles for the newly formed Ford Motor Company. Henry Ford had the vision and the marketing flair, but he lacked the machining capacity to build a reliable product. The Dodge brothers didn't just build the parts, they re-engineered them. They took Ford's rudimentary designs and applied the principles of vanadium steel and precision tolerances. For their investment of $10,000 in parts and labor, roughly $340,000 today, they received 10% of Ford's company. For the next decade, the Dodge brothers were the silent masters of the Ford empire, their foundry in Hamtramck producing the heartbeat of the Model T. The macro context of Detroit at the turn of the century was one of violent, unregulated growth. It was a city of saloons and smoke, where labor laws were non-existent, and the open shop was the religion of the industrialist. The Dodge brothers fit this environment perfectly. They were known to frequent the Bucket of Blood, a notorious Detroit saloon, where they would settle business disputes with their fists as often as with contracts. They were excluded from the polite society of the old money elite, who viewed them as vulgar mechanics. This social rejection forged a permanent chip on their shoulders. They didn't want to join the elite. They wanted to build a machine that would run them over. They lived in a world of physical, tactile reality, the smell of sulfur from the blast furnaces, the vibration of steam-powered hammers, and the searing heat of molten iron. Archival records from the early Ford years show that John Dodge was the administrative hammer, while Horace was the engineering soul. Horace would often spend 20 hours straight in the shop, his hands permanently stained with a mixture of graphite and machine oil. He was known to have a Steinway piano in his home, playing complex classical pieces to decompress after a day of shouting over the roar of the foundry. This duality, the brute and the artist, was the secret of their success. By 1913, their 10% stake in Ford was generating millions in dividends, but the relationship with Henry was disintegrating. Ford was a pacifist and a control freak. The Dodges were aggressive expansionists. The brothers realized that as long as they were building Ford's cars, they were merely servants to a man they no longer respected. The brothers swore that nothing would ever separate them, but biology was about to prove that even the hardest Dodge steel was not indestructible. In July 1914, the tether between the Dodge brothers and Henry Ford finally snapped. For a decade, the brothers had been the mechanical engine of Ford's success, but they were tired of being the shadows behind the man. They incorporated the Dodge Brothers Motor Company with a staggering $5 million in initial capital, the equivalent of $156 million in 2026. This was not a startup funded by venture capital. It was a fortress built on 10 years of accumulated dividends and manufacturing dominance. On November 14, 1914, the first Dodge Brothers car, affectionately known as Old Betsy, rolled off the assembly line. It was a 35-horsepower touring car that signaled the end of the flimsy, wood-framed era of automotive design. While Henry Ford's Model T was a skeletal utility vehicle designed for the masses, the Dodge Model 30 was a sophisticated machine designed for the survivor. Technically, the Model 30 was a revolution of metallurgy. It was the first mass-produced car in history to feature an all-steel, all-welded body supplied by the Budd Company of Philadelphia. Most competitors were still using composite bodies, wooden frames draped with thin metal skins that groaned and splintered on the rutted American roads of the 1910s. The Dodge chassis was a masterpiece of vanadium steel, providing a strength-to-weight ratio that was previously reserved for locomotive components. The engine was a 4-cylinder block with a 3.8-liter displacement, featuring a primitive but effective pressurized oiling system. Unlike the Ford, which used a confusing planetary transmission, the Dodge used a modern 3-speed selective sliding gear system. It was a car built by machinists who hated fragility. Macroeconomically, 1914 was a year of global fracture. As World War I ignited in Europe, the American industrial machine shifted into a higher gear. The Dodge brothers were perfectly positioned to capitalize on the chaos. While the war disrupted international trade, it catalyzed domestic demand for reliable transport. By 1915, they were the third largest automaker in America, producing 45,000 cars a year. Their wealth grew at an exponential rate that defied contemporary logic. By 1919, their personal fortune was estimated at $100 million, a sum that in 2026 purchasing power exceeds $1.78 billion. This wealth was not tied up in speculative stocks. It was liquid, backed by the physical assets of the Hamtramck plant and a zero-debt balance sheet. They were the apex predators of the Detroit industrial jungle. The social context of this rise was one of bitter exclusion. Despite their billions, the brothers were blackballed from the Detroit Athletic Club and the elite circles of Grosse Pointe. The old money of Michigan, the timber and fur barons, viewed the Dodge brothers as grease monkeys who had struck gold. John Dodge reacted to this snobbery with volcanic rage. He famously walked into the lobby of an elite club, brandished a roll of high-denomination bills, and threatened to buy the entire building just to fire the doorman. To manifest their dominance, they began constructing architectural monuments. John started Meadowbrook Hall, a 110-room Tudor Revival mansion that cost $4 million in 1920, roughly $63 million today. It featured 39 chimneys and a massive pipe organ. They were building fortresses to house a legacy they believed would last for 1,000 years. Archival records of the era's etiquette reveal the deep chasm between the brothers and the society they sought to conquer. While the elite practiced the restrained manners of the Victorian era, the Dodge brothers remained intentionally uncouth. They refused to wear tuxedos to their own galas, opting for the same heavy wool suits they wore to the factory. They drank heavily, favoring high-proof bourbon in an era where the temperance movement was gaining legislative ground. Their wives, Anna and Matilda, were the ones tasked with the impossible job of laundering the family name. They spent millions on rare books, European art, and philanthropic endowments, trying to buy the respect that their husbands' fists could not command. The brothers were kings in the factory, but pariahs in the parlor. But the peak of their power was a fragile plateau. In early 1920, the brothers decided to attend the New York Automobile Show, the premier event for the industry they now dominated. It was intended to be a victory lap, a moment to showcase their latest innovations to the global press. They booked the most expensive suites at the Ritz-Carlton, surrounding themselves with the luxury that $100 million provided. They were at the absolute zenith of their influence, controlling a workforce of 20,000 men and a brand that was synonymous with American durability. However, no amount of steel or nickel plating could protect them from the microscopic reality of the 1920 influenza pandemic. At the height of the show, in the middle of a New York winter, both brothers fell ill. The trip to New York, intended to be a celebration of their immortality, would instead become the catalyst for the Dynasty's decapitation. The global reputation of the Dodge brand was not forged on the boulevards of Detroit, but in the hostile deserts of the Mexican border. In 1916, The United States launched the punitive expedition against the revolutionary leader Pancho Villa. This was the first motor-mechanized conflict in the history of the U.S. Army, and the Dodge Brothers car was its primary weapon. General John J. Pershing, a man obsessed with logistical efficiency, demanded a vehicle that could survive the alkaline dust and extreme temperatures of Chihuahua. He bypassed the more delicate luxury cars of the era and ordered 150 Dodge touring cars. These vehicles were stripped of their civilian comforts and pushed into a landscape that had previously been the sole domain of the cavalry horse. The technical performance of the Dodge in Mexico was legendary. A young lieutenant named George S. Patton Jr. led the first motorized attack in military history using 3 Dodge cars. On May 14, 1916, Patton and his men engaged Villa's commanders at a ranch near San Miguelito. The Dodges proved to be stable firing platforms, their high-torque engines allowing them to navigate the deep sand that bogged down other vehicles. Patton was so impressed by the vehicle's dependability, a term the brothers had trademarked, that he strapped the bodies of the slain revolutionaries to the hoods of the Dodges and drove back to camp. This grisly image, captured in early military photography, became an unintentional but powerful marketing tool. The Dodge was no longer just a car. It was a war machine. The macro context of this period was the transition from animal power to the internal combustion engine. The 1916 expedition proved that the horse was obsolete in modern warfare. The U.S. government subsequently ordered thousands of Dodge vehicles for use in World War I, utilizing them as ambulances, staff cars, and light transports. Each military contract was worth millions. By 1917, the company's valuation had ballooned, and the brothers were reaping profits that would be valued at over $250 million per year in 2026. They ran their empire with a strategic fury, refusing to take on outside investors or bank loans. They were the sole owners of their destiny, a rarity in an age where Wall Street was beginning to swallow the independent manufacturers of the Midwest. Inside the Hamtramck plant, the brothers implemented a management style that was both brutal and paternalistic. They paid wages that were consistently higher than the industry average, often reaching $7 a day in 1918, $145 today. But they demanded total mechanical obedience. John Dodge was known to walk the line, personally firing any man he caught being slack or clumsy. Yet they also provided a massive medical department, a company band, and a cafeteria that served high-quality meals at a loss to the company. They understood that the machine was only as good as the men who serviced it. This loyalty meant that during the labor strikes that crippled other manufacturers, the Dodge plant remained a humming fortress of production. Archive curiosities from the war years show the extent of the brothers' logistical genius. They developed a specialized export pack for their cars, allowing them to be partially disassembled and crated in a way that maximized cargo space on transatlantic ships. They also pioneered the use of service clinics, sending mechanics to the front lines in France to train soldiers on how to repair Dodge engines under fire. This created a generation of young men who returned from the war with an unshakable loyalty to the brand. To them, a Dodge wasn't just a vehicle. It was the machine that had brought them home alive. The brothers had successfully turned a mechanical product into a national institution. But while the empire was expanding into the sands of Mexico and the trenches of France, the internal defenses of the brothers were failing. The brawling brothers were invincible against Ford, against the army, and against the elites of Detroit. They had built a world of steel and fire where they were the undisputed gods. However, the very intensity that built the empire was hollowing them out from within. Their heavy drinking, their 20-hour workdays, and their refusal to rest had left their immune systems vulnerable. As they stood on the threshold of the 1920s, the strongest men in the world were about to find that the only enemy they couldn't defeat was a microscopic virus that didn't care about their billions. By the dawn of the 1930s, the Dodge fortune had transitioned from the kinetic energy of the factory floor to the static, suffocating opulence of Grosse Pointe. Anna Thompson Dodge, the widow of Horace, became the architect of the family's most extreme material manifestation, Rose Terrace. Completed in 1934, this was not merely a home. It was a sovereign state of French neoclassical excess. Designed by Horace Trumbauer, the same architect who built the mansions of the Vanderbilts, the second Rose Terrace cost $7 million to construct. In the economic reality of 2026, this is a construction project exceeding $158 million. It was built of Indiana limestone and featured 75 rooms, including a private theater, a gymnasium, and a pipe organ that required a full-time musician on staff. The estate was a technical marvel of its time, featuring an early form of centralized climate control and a telephonic internal communication system that rivaled the complexity of a small city's exchange. The interior of Rose Terrace was curated by Lord Joseph Duveen, the most predatory and successful art dealer of the early 20th century. Duveen recognized in Anna Dodge a desire to bury her nouveau riche origins under layers of European history. He sold her the 18th century treasures of the French aristocracy, including a desk that had belonged to Catherine the Great and a jewel casket owned by Marie Antoinette. The walls were lined with canvases by Gainsborough and Reynolds, purchased for sums that would translate to $20 million per painting today. The floors were covered in Savonnerie carpets, hand-woven in the 1600s for the Louvre. Every square inch of the estate was a rejection of the industrial grease that had funded it. This was the glittering peak of the Dodge lineage, where the only thing more abundant than the gold leaf was the profound isolation of its inhabitants. While the mansion served as the terrestrial anchor, the yacht Delphine served as the floating palace of the Dodge Heirs. Launched in 1921 and measuring 257 feet in length, it was the largest steam-powered yacht ever built in the United States. Technically, the Delphine was a masterpiece of naval engineering. It was powered by two massive quadruple expansion steam engines capable of 1,500 horsepower each, allowing the vessel to cut through the Great Lakes and the Atlantic with silent, vibrationless grace. The interior featured mahogany paneling from the Philippines, gold-plated bathroom fixtures, and a music room with a custom Steinway. The cost was $2.01 million, roughly $36.5 million today. The annual maintenance alone, which included a crew of 55 specialized sailors, stewards, and engineers, cost more than the combined salaries of 100 Dodge factory foremen. Macroeconomically, the early 1930s were defined by the crushing weight of the Great Depression. While the rest of America waited in breadlines and lived in Hoovervilles, the Dodge Heirs lived in a bubble of impenetrable liquidity. The irony of their wealth was sharp. Their fortune was built on the American worker's ability to buy a car, yet as the working class collapsed, the Dodge trust funds continued to swell from the interest of high-grade municipal bonds and government securities. The heirs, specifically Horace Jr. and Delphine, became symbols of the lost generation of wealth. They spent their days in a state of perpetual motion, flying private Sikorsky amphibians between Detroit, Palm Beach, and the French Riviera. They were the primary consumers of the golden age of travel, utilizing the newly formed Pan American Airways and the luxury liners of the Cunard Line, where a first-class suite cost $1,200 per crossing, $27,000 in 2026 value. The archival record of their parties during Prohibition reveals the family's total disregard for the law. While John and Horace had been heavy drinkers, their children turned intoxication into an art form. At Rose Terrace, illegal champagne was served from silver fountains, and the cellar was stocked with thousands of cases of pre-Prohibition Scotch and gin, hidden behind secret panels designed by the mansion's engineers. The social etiquette of the time demanded a rigorous schedule. Formal breakfast at 9 a.m., sporting activities, polo or speedboat racing, until noon, a multi-course lunch, tea at 4 p.m., and a 10-course dinner served by footmen in livery. This rigid structure was designed to give meaning to lives that had no occupation. For Horace Jr., the speed of his boats, like the Delphine Fourth, which he pushed to over 100 minutes at FM, was the only thing that could outrun the boredom of being a billionaire. But beneath the Savonnerie rugs and the mahogany decks of the Delphine, a structural rot was forming. The heirs had been given everything except a reason to exist. They were surrounded by beauty they didn't create and governed by a wealth they didn't earn. Behind the marble walls of Rose Terrace, the isolation was creating a generation of young people who were functionally illiterate in the language of human struggle. They were about to discover that while money can build a fortress, it also creates a perfect vacuum. In the public eye, the Dodge Heirs were the American equivalent of royalty, their every movement tracked by the society pages of the Hearst newspapers. Delphine Dodge, dubbed the Princessa of Detroit, was the ultimate debutante. In 1922, her wedding to James H.R. Cromwell was the social event of the decade. Cromwell was the son of Eva Stotesbury, the queen of Philadelphia society, and the marriage was intended to be a merger of Detroit's industrial gold and Philadelphia's established social clout. The wedding was a display of calculated excess. The bride wore a gown of silver lace and a string of pearls valued at $800,000 at the time, over $14 million today. The reception featured a 50-piece orchestra and enough caviar to bankrupt a small European duchy. To the public, it was a fairy tale of the machine age. In reality, the marriage was a tactical disaster. James Cromwell was an ambitious man who viewed Delphine's trust fund as a tool for his political and business aspirations. The couple lived in a state of high-velocity dysfunction, traveling the world while their relationship eroded in luxury hotels. Delphine, like her brother Horace Jr., was plagued by an insatiable restlessness. She was a flapper of the highest order, defying the Victorian expectations of her mother. She was known to drive her own custom-built Dodge Roadsters at dangerous speeds through the streets of Grosse Pointe and frequented the jazz clubs of Harlem, where she was often the only woman in furs and diamonds. The mask of the perfect couple was maintained for the cameras of Pathé News, but the internal reality was one of infidelities, massive gambling debts, and a growing reliance on barbiturates. Horace Dodge Jr., meanwhile, was cultivating the persona of the playboy of the Western world. His life was a blur of high-stakes speedboat racing and failed marriages. By 1935, he had already been through 2 of what would eventually be 5 wives. His second wife, Muriel Sisman, was a Detroit socialite who quickly realized that she was not married to a man, but to a set of vices. Horace Jr. suffered from a profound inferiority complex regarding his father's legacy. He couldn't build an engine, so he broke them. He spent millions on his Dodge Boats division, a commercial failure that served primarily as a playground for his obsession with the Gold Cup races. He was frequently arrested for public intoxication and disorderly conduct, incidents that cost the Dodge estate thousands in legal settlements to keep his name out of the police blotters. Macroeconomically, the mid-1930s saw the rise of the soak the rich taxes under Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal. The Revenue Act of 1935 raised the top individual income tax rate to 79% for the Dodge heirs. This was an existential threat to their lifestyle. They began utilizing complex offshore tax havens and charitable foundations as shields. They donated millions to the Detroit Institute of Arts and the Detroit Symphony Orchestra, not necessarily out of a love for culture, but as a strategic necessity to maintain their social mask and protect their capital from the federal government. These donations, while seemingly altruistic, were calculated moves in a high-stakes game of financial survival. A $100,000 gift to a museum in 1936, $2.2 million today, could save the estate 5 times that amount in tax liabilities. Secondary characters in this drama were the old money families of Detroit, the Joys, the Newberrys, and the Algers. They watched the Dodge heirs with a mixture of horror and fascination. The Dodges were too loud, too rich, and too public. The established elite practiced discreet wealth, while the Dodge heirs practiced performance wealth. This tension came to a head in the exclusive yacht clubs and hunt clubs of Michigan, where the Dodge name was often blackballed despite their immense donations. This social rejection fueled the heirs' self-destructive streaks. If they couldn't be respected, they would be notorious. They turned their backs on the Midwest and sought the company of the international set, European royals in exile, Hollywood stars like Douglas Fairbanks, and professional gamblers who viewed the Dodge trust funds as an open buffet. The archival details of their divorces provide a window into the era's legal and social brutality. Divorce in the 1930s was still a scandalous affair, often requiring proof of adultery or cruelty. The Dodge legal teams became experts in the quiet settlement, paying out millions to disgruntled spouses to avoid public testimony. In 1934, Delphine's divorce from Cromwell cost her a significant portion of her liquid assets, but the emotional cost was higher. She began to retreat into a world of social illness, a 1930s euphemism for alcoholism and depression. The social mask was no longer just a tool for status. It had become a cage. Behind the pearls and the press releases, the heirs were beginning to realize that the one thing their $146 million couldn't buy was a way out of their own names. The facade of luxury was hiding an existential void that no diamond could fill, and as the 1930s bled into the 1940s, the world was about to change in a way that would make their gilded lives look like a relic of a forgotten civilization. The year 1920 was the chronological fault line where the Dodge brothers' industrial triumph collided with the biological fragility of the human machine. On the morning of January 5, 1920, the brothers were in New York City for the National Automobile Show. They were at the absolute peak of their influence, yet they were walking into a city gripped by the second lethal wave of the Spanish flu. John Dodge, the volcanic strategist, was the first to succumb. He retreated to his suite at the Ritz-Carlton with what seemed like a common cold, but within days, his lungs began to fill with fluid, a process technically known as pulmonary edema caused by the H1N1 virus. In an era before antibiotics or mechanical ventilators, the medical protocol was primitive: mustard plasters, whiskey, and prayer. On January 14, 1920, John Francis Dodge died at the age of 55. His estate was valued at over $40 million at the time, roughly $635 million in 2026 currency. The technical vacuum created by John's death was immediate. While Horace was the engineering genius, John was the one who managed the friction of the real world, the labor unions, the suppliers, and the legal battles with Henry Ford. Horace, however, was incapable of mourning. The brothers had been so synchronized that their nervous systems seemed linked. Following John's funeral, Horace's health disintegrated with terrifying speed. Doctors diagnosed him with cirrhosis and chronic grief, but it was likely a combination of the same influenza strain and a total systemic collapse. He spent the summer of 1920 at his Florida estate, but the heat offered no reprieve. On December 10, 1920, less than 11 months after his brother, Horace Elgin Dodge, died in Palm Beach, he left behind a fortune of $60 million, a sum that scales to nearly $950 million today. In a single calendar year, the brain and the heart of the Dodge empire had been extinguished. Macroeconomically, 1920 was a year of violent transition. The United States was shifting from a wartime economy to a consumer-driven one. The 18th Amendment had just established prohibition, turning the brothers' favorite vice, high-proof bourbon, into a criminal enterprise. The Red Scare was sweeping through Detroit's factories, with federal agents raiding union halls. Without the brawling brothers to stare down the agitators, the Hamtramck plant became a site of profound uncertainty. The stock market was volatile, and the post-war recession was beginning to bite into the automotive sector. Amidst this chaos, the leadership of the third largest automaker in the world fell into the hands of two widows, Anna and Matilda. These women, who had been excluded from the boardrooms for decades, suddenly held the keys to an industrial fortress. The archival details of the brothers' funerals provide a somber look at the scale of their impact. Detroit essentially shut down. 10,000 factory workers stood in the freezing slush to watch the funeral processions pass. John's casket was bronze, weighing over 800 pounds, a final piece of heavy metal for a man who lived by the forge. The cost of the floral arrangements alone, over $25,000 in 1920, $400,000 today, could have funded a small hospital. The secondary characters in this transition were the Dodge executives, men like Frederick Haynes, who had been with the brothers since the bicycle days. They attempted to maintain the Dodge way, but the spirit of the company was gone. The board meetings, once characterized by the brothers' shouting matches and shared laughter, were now silent, sterile affairs presided over by lawyers and trust officers. Curiosities of the 1920-era legalities show that the Dodge estate was one of the first to navigate the newly formed federal estate tax, which had only been made permanent in 1916. The widows were forced to liquidate millions in assets just to settle the tax bill, a process that took years. During this time, the children, Horace Jr. and Delphine, were coming of age. They were the first generation of Dodges to never have worked in a machine shop. Their inheritance was not a set of tools, but a set of ledgers. The transition from production wealth to inherited wealth was complete. The widows, fearing the volatility of the industry without their husbands, began to look for an exit strategy. They were surrounded by advisors who saw the Dodge fortune as a carcass to be picked clean, and the wolves of Wall Street began to circle the Grosse Pointe mansions. But the most tragic element of 1920 was not the loss of the money, but the loss of the purpose. John and Horace had built their empire to sustain a lineage, yet by dying simultaneously, they left that lineage without a roadmap. The children were left in a world of infinite luxury and zero direction. The fortune that had been built through grease and brotherhood was now just a collection of numbers on a page, waiting to be spent by a generation that had never seen a blast furnace. With the patriarchs dead, the financial sharks began to calculate the exact price of the widow's grief, waiting for the moment when the burden of the empire would become too heavy to bear. Horace Dodge Jr. was the living embodiment of the second-generation curse. Lacking his father's mechanical discipline, but inheriting his volcanic temperament, he turned to the only arena where he could prove his worth: the high-velocity world of powerboat racing. Technically, Horace Jr. was an innovator in the field of hydroplanes, but his innovation was funded by a bottomless well of trust fund capital. His primary weapon was the Delphine IV, a 26-foot racing boat powered by a monstrous 24-cylinder Allison aircraft engine. This engine, a relic of early aviation engineering, produced over 1,000 horsepower and consumed high-octane aviation fuel at a rate of 60 gallons per hour. Horace Jr. spent over $1 million, roughly $18 million in 2026, on his racing team, employing a permanent staff of 12 mechanics whose only job was to keep his fragile, mahogany-hulled machines from disintegrating at 100 mm pace. His addiction to speed was mirrored by a more sinister addiction to alcohol. During the height of Prohibition, Horace Jr. operated as if the law were a minor inconvenience for the poor. His private cellar at Rose Terrace was stocked with thousands of cases of bootlegged Scotch and Canadian Club smuggled across the Detroit River, ironically often in boats powered by Dodge-built engines. The cost of his personal consumption was astronomical. Archival ledgers suggest his entertainment and liquor expenses exceeded $50,000 a year in 1932, a staggering $1.1 million today. Alcohol was not a social lubricant for him. It was a sedative for the anxiety of being the son of a titan. He was frequently seen at the 21 Club in New York, surrounded by yes-men and sycophants who encouraged his benders in exchange for access to his checkbook. The macro context of the 1930s Playboy era was one of desperate hedonism. As the Great Depression ravaged the American heartland, the ultra-wealthy withdrew into a subculture of extreme sports and scandal. Horace Jr. became a fixture of the tabloids, not for his racing victories but for his catastrophic personal life. He married and divorced 5 times, with each settlement becoming more expensive and more public. His 1935 divorce from Muriel Sisman cost the estate a lump sum of $1, $5 million, over $34 million today, plus ongoing alimony and child support. The legal fees alone for his various domestic disputes could have purchased a fleet of the very cars his father had built. He was the primary target of the newly formed paparazzi, who specialized in capturing the Dodge heir in states of public disarray, stumbling out of casinos or being hauled into police stations for reckless driving. Secondary characters in this spiral included his 5 wives, who were often aspiring actresses or socialites looking for a shortcut to the Dodge billions. His fourth wife, the showgirl Clara Tinsley, once famously remarked that being married to Horace was like living inside a tornado made of money and gin. The toll on his physical health was technical and cumulative. By his late 30s, Horace Jr. was suffering from the early stages of the same cirrhosis that had claimed his father, compounded by multiple concussions sustained in high-speed boat crashes. He once flipped a boat at 90 mph on Lake Carnegie, an accident that should have killed him, but instead left him with a lifelong dependency on morphine and other painkillers, substances that were easily obtained through the family's high society physicians. Archival curiosities of his lifestyle include the customization of his vehicles. He refused to drive standard Dodge production cars. Instead, he commissioned one-off roadsters with custom bodies by coach builders like LeBaron or Dietrich. These cars featured silver-plated dashboards, Connolly leather interiors, and engines tuned to racing specifications. A single custom car could cost $15,000 in 1934, $350,000 today. He also maintained a private air force, including a Lockheed Vega that he used to commute between his estates, bypassing the common experience of the American railroad. This total insulation from reality meant that Horace Jr. never learned the value of a dollar, only the speed at which it could be spent. The tragedy of Horace Jr.'s addiction was its predictability. He was a man who had been given the power of a god and the responsibility of a child. His father had built the brand to be dependable, but Horace Jr. was the most erratic element in the family equation. Every time he crashed a boat, every time he ended a marriage, and every time he was photographed in a drunken stupor, the Dodge name, the name that graced millions of radiator grills across the globe, lost a piece of its integrity. He was not just spending money. He was spending his father's honor. Addiction does not discriminate based on class, but in a mansion with 75 rooms, it has more places to hide until the damage is irreversible. By the late 1940s, Horace Jr. was a ghost of a man, his fortune dwindling and his health failing as the legal system finally prepared to do what the 100 mph boats could not: bring him to a dead stop. The $146 million windfall of 1925 did not bring peace to the Dodge household. It functioned as a high-velocity accelerant for a dormant civil war. The legal architecture of the Dodge fortune was primarily governed by the Dodge Trust, a complex instrument of Michigan probate law designed by the brothers' attorneys to ensure perpetual wealth. However, the trust had a fatal flaw. It was built for a unified family, not for a group of heirs consumed by mutual resentment. By the late 1920s, the Wayne County Probate Court became the secondary office of the Dodge family, as the children began a relentless campaign to break their father's wills. The technical crux of the battle was the rule against perpetuities, a common law principle that prevents property from being tied up in a trust forever. The Dodge heirs hired the most expensive legal minds in the Midwest to argue that the trust's restrictions were an unlawful restraint on their personal liberty and access to capital. The most aggressive combatant was John Duval Dodge, the firstborn son of John Dodge. John Duval had been the black sheep of the dynasty, famously disinherited by his father for his refusal to conform to the family's industrial discipline. His father's will had left him a pittance, a monthly stipend of $150, roughly $2,700 today, while his sisters and stepmother controlled millions. John Duval's legal strategy was a scorched earth policy. He challenged the sanity of his father and the validity of the 1925 sale, claiming he had been defrauded of his birthright. The litigation lasted for over a decade, involving thousands of pages of depositions that aired every dark corner of the Dodge domestic life. In 1939, a settlement was finally reached, granting John Duval a lump sum of $1.9 million. In 2026 value, this was a $45.6 million payout, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. The legal fees consumed nearly 30% of the settlement, and John Duval died shortly after, his life defined more by the pursuit of the money than the possession of it. Macroeconomically, the 1930s and 40s saw a massive shift in American tax and probate law. The introduction of the gift tax in 1932 and the subsequent hikes in estate taxes meant that every legal maneuver by the Dodge heirs was a race against the Internal Revenue Service. The Dodge fortune was being squeezed between the greed of the heirs and the predatory efficiency of the federal government. For every dollar spent on a lawyer, another was lost to the taxman. The family's legal battles coincided with the Great Depression's peak, making their public bickering over millions particularly galling to a public struggling for survival. This led to a series of nuisance lawsuits from creditors and former employees who viewed the Dodge estate as a bottomless well. The cost of defending these suits added another layer of attrition to the family's liquidity. Secondary characters in this legal theater included Judge Joseph Murphy, who presided over many of the Dodge hearings. He grew so frustrated with the family's incessant litigation that he once remarked in open court that the Dodge heirs are the best argument I've ever seen for the total abolition of inherited wealth. The lawyers themselves from firms like Miller, Canfield, Paddock, and Stone became the silent beneficiaries of the Dodge tragedy. They charged retainers that exceeded $50,000 per year, $1.1 million today, simply to manage the paperwork generated by the heirs' whims. The archival transcripts reveal a family that communicated almost exclusively through legal motions. There were no more Sunday dinners at Rose Terrace. There were only depositions in wood-paneled conference rooms. The technical specifics of the asset liquidation were equally brutal. To fund the ongoing legal wars and the heirs' lifestyles, the trust was forced to sell off high-performing assets at inopportune times. They liquidated blocks of municipal bonds during market troughs and sold off real estate holdings in Detroit just as the city's property values began to fluctuate. By 1945, the $146 million that should have been an eternal endowment had been structurally compromised. The Dodge Trust was no longer a fortress. It was a sieve. The heirs were winning their cases in court, but they were losing the war of mathematics. They were successfully breaking the trust, unaware that the trust was the only thing protecting them from themselves. The legal fees were only the beginning of the hemorrhage. As the family fought over the remains of the past, the physical reality of their bodies was beginning to reflect the rot in their ledgers. They were so busy fighting for the right to spend the future that they didn't notice the future was rapidly running out of time. The 1950s heralded the era of lead for the Dodge Dynasty as the physical toll of decades of excess finally breached the walls of their fortresses. Horace Dodge Jr., once the fastest man on the water, was now a prisoner of his own biology. By his early 50s, the technical reality of his condition was a textbook of systemic failure. Advanced cirrhosis of the liver, chronic hypertension, and peripheral neuropathy that rendered his legs nearly useless. He navigated the 75 rooms of Rose Terrace in a custom-built, motorized wheelchair, a pathetic irony for a man whose name was synonymous with automotive horsepower. The wheelchair was upholstered in the same Connolly leather as his racing boats, but it moved at a walking pace through silent hallways. The sound of the electric motor humming across the marble floors was the only heartbeat left in the mansion. The architecture of Rose Terrace, once a stage for grand galas, had been converted into a high-end hospice. The mansion was equipped with an internal security system that was state-of-the-art for the 1950s. Infrared sensors and closed-circuit television, but these tools were not used to keep intruders out. They were used to monitor the parasites. Horace Jr. lived in a state of clinical paranoia, convinced that his nurses, his few remaining friends, and even his fifth wife, the actress Greg Sherwood, were conspiring to poison him or alter his will. He spent upwards of $200,000 a year, roughly $2.6 million today, on private security and medical staff. His daily regimen included a cocktail of barbiturates to sleep and amphetamines to wake, all administered by physicians whose primary qualification was their willingness to ignore the patient's obvious self-destruction. The decline of Delphine Dodge was even more precipitous. In 1943, at the age of 44, the Princessa of Detroit died in her mansion. The official cause was complications from an intestinal ailment, a common euphemism of the era for the final stages of chronic alcoholism. Delphine had spent her final years in a recursive loop of depression and substance abuse, her beauty ravaged by the very lifestyle she had been born to lead. She left behind a daughter, also named Delphine, who would inherit a fractured version of the fortune. The macro context of Delphine's death was a world at war. While millions were dying in the trenches of WI2, a Dodge heir died in a gilded bed from the sheer weight of her own boredom. Her death was a shock to the Grosse Pointe elite, a grim reminder that the Dodge money offered no immunity against the laws of chemistry. Secondary characters in this final act were the hang-ons, a shifting cast of minor European nobility, failed actors, and professional gamblers who populated the Dodge estates. They were paid in loans that were never repaid and gifts of jewelry and cars. One such character, a colonel who claimed to be a war hero, lived in the guest wing of Rose Terrace for 3 years without ever being asked to leave. He was eventually found to be a fraud who had systematically drained over $100,000, $1, $3 million today, from Horace Jr.'s personal accounts. The archives of the estate show a staggering list of miscellaneous expenses. $5,000 for a single night's gambling debt in Havana. $10,000 for a diamond bracelet for a woman Horace Jr. had met only twice. The money was not being spent. It was being bled out. The physical decay of the family was mirrored by the decay of their properties. Rose Terrace, despite its staff of 40, began to show signs of structural neglect. The Indiana limestone was stained by the Detroit soot, and the intricate pipe organ, the pride of Horace Sr., sat silent, its bellows cracked and filled with dust. The golden age had tarnished into a dull, leaden gray. Horace Jr. spent his final years in a darkened suite, watching old newsreels of his father's factories and his own boat races. He was a man out of time, a relic of a robust industrial era trapped in a body that had been softened by 3 decades of unearned luxury. The paranoia grew so intense that he reportedly slept with a gold-plated revolver under his pillow, terrified of the very ghosts his fortune had summoned. The lineage was dying, and with it, the last connection to the brothers who had dreamed of the perfect engine. The Dodge name was still visible on the grills of millions of cars across the globe, but the men and women who bore that name were now nothing more than high-maintenance patients in a house of stone. The final collapse was no longer a question of if, but of when. The era of lead was ending, and the era of the auctioneer was about to begin. As Horace Jr.'s breath grew shallow in the quiet of Rose Terrace, the world outside was already beginning to value the mansion not as a home, but as a collection of parts. On the evening of December 22, 1963, while the world was still reeling from the assassination of John F. Kennedy, a smaller but equally symbolic death occurred in a darkened suite in Detroit. Horace Dodge Jr., the man who had spent 40 years trying to outrun his father's shadow at 100 miles per hour, finally succumbed to systemic failure. He was 63 years old. His death was not a national tragedy. It was a logistical conclusion. The man who once commanded a fortune that could purchase entire cities died in a state of relative isolation, surrounded by hired medical staff and a 5th wife, Greg Sherwood, who was already embroiled in a legal battle over his dwindling assets. The technical reality of his passing was a grim catalogue of a life lived in excess. His heart, enlarged and weakened by decades of alcoholism and the stress of high-speed racing, simply stopped. There were no brothers to mourn him, and the industrial empire that bore his name had long since been integrated into the massive, impersonal machinery of the Chrysler Corporation. The macroeconomic context of the 1960s had rendered the Dodge heirs obsolete. The era of the individual industrial titan had been replaced by the era of the technocratic manager. The Grosse Pointe estates, once the beating heart of American power, were becoming white elephants, massive, unmarketable ruins of a forgotten age. Anna Thompson Dodge, the matriarch who had signed the $146 million check in 1925, was still alive, a 95-year-old ghost presiding over the hollowed-out remains of Rose Terrace. She had outlived both of her children, Delphine and Horace Jr., witnessing the total biological collapse of her lineage. The technical burden of maintaining Rose Terrace had become unsustainable. The annual property taxes and maintenance costs had ballooned to over $300,000 in 1965, roughly $2, $9 million today, draining what remained of the liquid trust funds. The estate was no longer a home, it was a liability. The secondary character of this final chapter was Greg Sherwood, a former Miss Florida and nightclub singer whose marriage to Horace Jr. was a tabloid staple. Following his death, the legal bloodbath reached its zenith. Sherwood fought the Dodge trustees for years, claiming she had been starved of her rightful lifestyle. The archives reveal a woman trapped in a cycle of litigation that mirrored the Heirs' own battles 40 years earlier. In a moment of high farcical tragedy, Sherwood was eventually forced to auction off her personal effects to pay her legal bills. The jewelry that had been purchased with the sweat of the Hamtramck factory workers was sold at a discount to collectors who didn't know the Dodge name from a brand of soap. The cycle of the Dodge fortune was now a downward spiral of liquidation. In 1971, following the death of Anna Dodge at the age of 102, the final dissolution began. The auction of the contents of Rose Terrace was handled by Christie's and Park Burnett, an event that lasted 5 days and drew dealers from across the globe. The technical inventory was staggering. 18th century French furniture, Sèvres porcelain, and the $1 million, now $7.8 million collection of jewelry. The desk of Catherine the Great, which Anna had bought to prove her status, sold for a fraction of its inflation-adjusted value. The most visceral moment of the final act, however, was not the auction, but the demolition. Because no single buyer could be found for a 75-room limestone palace in a shifting Detroit economy, Rose Terrace II was sold to a developer for the land value alone. In 1976, the wrecking ball arrived. The technical specifications of the demolition were a testament to the brothers' obsession with durability. The steel-reinforced concrete and Indiana limestone were so thick that the demolition crews had to use specialized industrial shears and repeated impacts from a 5-ton iron ball to breach the walls. It took months to erase what had taken years to build. As the marble staircases were pulverized into gravel, the site was subdivided into 29 ordinary suburban lots. The Rose Terrace subdivision was born. A collection of mid-sized houses for the upper middle class, built on the dust of a dynasty. The event of May 1st, 1925, the signature on the $146 million check, had finally been fully processed. The capital had been spent, the assets had been sold, and the monument had been leveled. The irony of the final act was that the money had performed exactly as intended. It had been consumed. John and Horace had built a machine for wealth, but they had failed to build a vessel to contain it. As the last of the Dodge family's personal property was hauled away in moving vans, the only thing that remained of their presence in Detroit was the soot on the factory windows of Hamtramck. Only one question remained. Where did all that gold go? Today, the Dodge name exists in a state of profound corporate abstraction. The company that John and Horace built in a grease-stained workshop is now a subsidiary of Stellantis, a multinational conglomerate headquartered in Amsterdam. The Dodge brand has been meticulously engineered by marketing psychologists to evoke the very things the Heirs lacked: raw power, blue-collar grit, and muscle. The modern Dodge Challenger and Charger, with their 700 horsepower engines, are digital homages to the brawling brothers. Yet, in the glass and steel boardrooms where the brand's future is decided, there is not a single person with the name Dodge. The family's connection to the product ended not with a bang, but with a series of bank transfers that began a century ago. The brand is a ghost, a carefully preserved aesthetic of rebellion owned by a global entity. Technically, the only physical piece of the Dodge glory that survives in its original form is the yacht Delphine. After decades of neglect, including a stint as a training vessel for the South Korean Navy and a period of literal abandonment where it sank at its moorings, the yacht was rescued and restored in the early 2000s. The restoration, conducted in Bruges, Belgium, was a $40 million technical feat. The original quadruple expansion steam engines, the The same ones Horace Sr., obsessed over, were painstakingly rebuilt, making the Delphine the only large steam yacht from the Great Lakes era still in operation. It now serves as a charter vessel for the ultra-wealthy in the Mediterranean, costing upwards of $100,000 per week to rent. It is a floating museum of a lost age of engineering, a singular survivor of a family that couldn't survive its own wealth. The macro context of the 21st century has turned the Dodge story into a cautionary tale of the three-generation rule. The first generation builds, the second spends, and the third destroys. The estimated $2.6 billion in 2026 value that was paid for the company in 1925 has been fragmented into thousands of small trust accounts, dissipated through 5 generations of heirs, or consumed by the estate taxes of the 1940s. There are still Dodge descendants living today, but they are private citizens, their lives disconnected from the industrial furnaces of Detroit. They live in modest luxury or quiet obscurity. The Dodge on their passports, a curiosity rather than a title of power. The great fortune was not stolen. It was simply inhaled by the passage of time and the friction of a life without purpose. Archival remnants of the family are scattered in museums. The Detroit Institute of Arts holds the paintings Anna Dodge bought to hide her origins, and the Meadowbrook Hall remains as a historic site, preserved because it belonged to Matilda Dodge Wilson, who managed her portion of the fortune with a discipline the other heirs lacked. But the ruins of the Dodge dream are most visible in the empty spaces of Grosse Pointe. Where Rose Terrace once stood, there are now landscaped lawns and private property signs of a different, more discreet class of wealth. The brawling, drinking, engine-building brothers from Niles, Michigan would not recognize the world their money created. They built for permanence, but they invested in a generation that was built for obsolescence. The secondary characters of the modern era are the collectors and enthusiasts. There is a technical subculture dedicated to the Dodge Brothers-era cars, men who spend thousands of hours restoring the Model 30s and the early trucks. To them, the Dodge is a symbol of American reliability, a dependability that outlasted the family itself. In the cemeteries of Detroit, the Dodge Mausoleum stands as a final architectural statement. It is a massive granite structure, silent and impenetrable. Inside lie John and Horace, side by side, as they always were. They are surrounded by the children who couldn't handle the fire they started, and the wives who tried to turn that fire into a social light. The story of the Dodge heirs is the ultimate proof that money is not a legacy. It is merely a fuel. If the engine is poorly designed, no amount of fuel can prevent the explosion. The brothers built the most reliable cars in the world, machines designed to endure the harshest conditions of the human landscape. But in their obsession with the steel and the grease, they forgot to engineer the one thing that truly matters. In the end, the Dodge brothers built machines that could last forever, but they forgot to build heirs capable of bearing the weight of their own gold.